Divine Truth Events. These are events and presentations by Jesus and Mary. This presentation is part of the General Discussion Series, and it is a question and answer session from people in San Diego. Presented by Jesus on the 3rd of November 2013 in San Diego, California, USA. This is Session 2, Part 2.
So you've just got it's only the little T and W that you can muck around with. That's the one. Yeah. Fire away.
Thank you. I had been listening to the FAQs, and you said that you are Jesus and you aren't reincarnated. So could you explain that whole process?
Certainly, I can explain that. First thing I'd like to say, I've spoken many times about reincarnation, and there are many videos about reincarnation, but I would like to do a whole series of FAQs about reincarnation at some point. First thing I'd like to say is that reincarnation as taught on Earth currently is not true. All right? That's probably a good thing. And you can keep your mic with me if you want to comment through my. So let's look at the understanding of reincarnation that the Earth currently has, which I'm saying is not true. Shall we? Basically what it's saying is that people have some form of consciousness. It's a very loose definition because many people who believe in reincarnation don't know what that is. In the spirit world, so they are spirits. And here's the earth, and at some point, whenever a new child is conceived, there is at some point the person comes and basically inhabits the body of the child on earth. And there's no clear definition in most reincarnation teachings of when that occurs. In other words, some of them think that it occurs at the time of conception. Others believe it occurs at the time of birth. And in fact, historically, others believed it occurred at all different times in between, in fact. And in fact, there are some thoughts that it occurs at 3 months after conception and 2 months after conception. And there are all sorts of very loose ideas and concepts about the teaching. But basically the teaching is the person from the spirit world comes and inhabits the body of a person that's been created on earth by parents and basically then lives their life on earth. Now, of course, at some point they had to have a first incarnation. So at some point they had a first time they come. And then what happens is after they grow old, so they're old now, I don't know how to draw a stick figure old person, but anyway, let's say he's an old version now. Maybe he needs to be black. Maybe he's near death, so he's black, right? So he's now an old version of that. He dies. He goes back to some undefined location. And again, for many of the teachings, there's a wide variety of suggestions of where that might be. He has some kind of, generally it's accepted that he has some kind of life review about the life he spent on earth, right? And then, of course, he incurred certain amounts of what is classified as karma. In other words, he did some bad things while he was on earth that he should be sorry for, but he wasn't. And so so now he's basically forced to go back to earth again. And there's even the concept that we are neutral in gender in the spirit world, and we reincarnate as a male or a female or a male or a female, and that we have many of these cycles. And in fact, books like the Conversations with God book suggest 700,000-800,000 cycles, and in fact many people who believe in the teaching of reincarnation believe that this is an infinite process, but many of them don't. Some of them believe that after you've done enough cycles and learnt enough things and actually have the last life being a loving life, in other words, you've paid all the karma, you then get to stay in the spirit world in a higher location somewhere, but nobody's really certain where that is or what happens there. And I'm not being facetious, I'm just saying that's what the case is, right? The case is it's a very, very loose theory about life, about what happens with life after death and also before death. But that's the general teachings of reincarnation. And we have many flavours of it. It started many thousands of years ago, actually, in terms of the first flavours that were introduced about reincarnation started many thousands of years ago. And they started with the concept, what they noticed was, and this is where we've got to be careful about what we noticed and then making assumptions. What they noticed was they had a child born, and sometimes the personality of that child was very similar to somebody who had died, right? And so they thought, well, the person who died must be that child again. That was the assumption. Right? Of course, there's a lot of other possible solutions to that particular problem, if you could call it a problem, but that was the underlying assumption. And there was also this concept that once one person breathed out their life, that breath of life would enter another. Does that make sense? And so there was this concept of the cycle of the breath of life that began in very, very olden philosophies, mostly around what you now know as the Indian continent today. The philosophies, a lot of times these philosophies were attributed to Egypt, but actually most people in Egypt never believed them. It was mostly people from the Eastern philosophies, which are more the Asian types of communities, and the Indian types of communities that believe these kind of belief systems. But as time has gone on, more and more people have become interested in the philosophy. And there are very good reasons for this, because more and more spirits have try reincarnating. And when I say try reincarnating, they can't actually reincarnate. So you know what they do? They overcloak children. They overcloak the body of children, which they see as their vessel that they can use to relive life on earth. Many of these spirits don't want to go to the spirit world for a lot of reasons. Some of them are about avoiding a lot of their darker emotions, and also avoiding a lot of the pain they've created in their life that they've just had on earth. And so what they do is they revisit the earth again, and they connect themselves usually in the womb if the mum and dad allow it, but if not in the womb, as soon as the child is born, they connect to the body of the child, and they influence the child for the rest of its life. Right? So they actually live on earth with that child for the rest of its life.
So they're sucking energy.
Exactly, that's exactly what they're doing. They're sucking the life out of, and also influencing the will of, the next generation of children. That's what they're doing. All right? Now, the more they teach the belief of reincarnation, the more openness there is on earth to allowing this to occur. So in other words, teaching the belief of reincarnation supports these spirits to overcloak more and more children and then live their life on earth again through that child. So it's actually a very damaging teaching that causes a lot of damage to our children. And many parents accept it. Many parents accept it, particularly in Eastern philosophies, but now it's coming more and more into Western philosophy. And as a result, many people in the West are now accepting this. So many people in the West do not realise, but their openness to these kind of teachings allows spirits to overcloak their own children, and then those spirits live with their children the rest of their life. And a lot of times, the parent's proud of that. The parent thinks it's a wonderful thing. And the children sprout all of this wisdom, which is actually a spirit who's lived on earth before, who's in the spirit world, who've investigated some of these things, sprouting their wisdom through the child.
Well, is that how a child...
You need to use the microphone.
Is that how a child...
Just closer so I can hear you.
Is that how a child could be like a musical prodigy at age 4?
Certainly. That's exactly how a child becomes a musical prodigy at age 4. Because the spirit overcloaking the child is a musical, has been played music all of his life. Does that make sense? This is how you've got mathematical prodigies, musical prodigies. All of these kind of prodigies are actually, at the moment, not in the future, this has to be, but at the moment, this is what's happening. There are these, because of these belief systems, there's these overcloaking of spirits occurring over the child, and so the spirit, of course, wants to pick up the musical instrument they used to play and play it. And of course, they know everything about it, right from the beginning, right? They don't have to learn anything because they already know. That's the reality, they already know. Now, this cycle can occur many times where, and I've talked to many spirits actually who have actually overcloaked one child till that child has died. They've come back, overcloaked another child till that child's died, come back, overcloaked another child till that child died, and they've done that many times. The same spirit, overcloaking child after child after child after child. Right? Now, they also overcloak in other situations. So, for example, you have a fairly common practice here amongst New Age circles of doing what they call past life regressions. Well, in past life regressions, what's actually happening is you've got a person on Earth who's the so-called therapist, and surrounding that person on Earth, there's literally thousands of spirits who want to have a life back on Earth, who are earthbound, and all they want to do is have a life back on Earth. So a person from Earth comes along and sits with the past life regression therapist. This therapist puts that person in a trance or in a hypnotic state, which is highly suggestible. Right? This means that this person no longer has full control using their will over their own body. Which means that any one of these spirits who surround the therapist can now overcloak the person and talk through them. And they take a video of this. And what it looks like is that the person has changed. And of course they have, because the person who should have control of that body has stepped back a bit in a hypnotic state, and the other people now are expressing themselves through the body of the person. Does that make sense? And now they take a photograph or a video of that, and they play that to the person. And the person goes, oh, wow, that means I was Joan of Arc. Because Joan of Arc come to speak to me, right? Come to speak through her. She now thinks she was that person, right? And because now her beliefs have been reinforced that she was this person of old times, that spirit now has a great opportunity to stay with her as long as possible. And it's also highly likely this person will allow that spirit to express herself through her own body. In other words, allow the spirit who claims to be Joan of Arc and probably isn't to connect to the person on Earth and express herself through the body of that person. And then they go to another therapist session. And what happens? The therapist puts them in another hypnotic state. What happens then? Another spirit comes. And the person's going, oh, this is another one of my past lives. And it's not. It's just another person who used to live on Earth, who's in the spirit world, who doesn't want to stay in the spirit world, who wants to live on Earth, trying to have another life on Earth through them. And yet she assumes, this lady here, who's the, shall we call them the patient? I don't know if you could call them such a thing. I would prefer to call them the victim of a great big deceit. That's what it is. They're a victim of deceit. Deceit of these spirits, but also deceit that comes from a false belief. A belief that we've had many, many past lives, and so at some point we're going to remember them. And of course, nobody ever remembers somebody who is not famous. they always remember somebody who was famous, right? They were always somebody who was in history somewhere. And the reason why is because all of these spirits are claiming to be someone popular so that they connect to this person's desire to be special. So it's just this person's desire to be special that's attracting a lot of these events. And then we have this continual cycle going on where all of these spirits start overcloaking the individual, and eventually this person ends up with what the doctors would define as an illness. And you know what that illness is called? Yeah, well, now it's called dissociative identity disorder, but it used to be called multiple personality disorder, which is basically a whole group of spirits now as an entourage around the individual because the person believes themselves to have been people in the past. Right? Now, while they do not always result in that, they do believe more and more that they were that person. They were that person. They died in the past with... And they were either male or female too. Many of them are men and women, so they're sometimes male and female, you know. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the many reasons why people believe in reincarnation. It's not a reason, it's just a false interpretation of a series of events. Mm-hmm. That's all it is. It's not a reason to believe in reincarnation because there are many much more simple explanations than reincarnation to explain what's going on here, and I've just given one of them. Mm-hmm. It's just a victim of deceit because these spirits don't want to be in the spirit world where they need to be in order to grow. They want to come back on earth and do it all again and have it all over somehow. And all they're trying to do is deceive the victim into believing that this is possible so that they can have their selfish needs met through that person. That's all they're trying to do. It's a great big hoax, right, in that regard. Now, the problem with that whole process is that it creates in this person, the victim, the belief that reincarnation is true without considering any other alternatives as to what's going on. Mm-hmm. That's what it does. And the problem with that is that this person then assumes that such a belief is true, and then when this person passes, what do you think they're going to do?
They're
going to probably do the same thing.
They'll follow the pattern.
Exactly. Yeah. So the problem is, and when we were in Brazil, it was really interesting because we had our first weekend session in Brazil. We had the Saturday we talked about the human soul and God, and then the Sunday we talked about spirit's influence. I think it was. No, it wasn't spirit influence. It was spirit. I think it was just reincarnation and spirits or something we talked about, and we channeled some spirits who actually believed that when a baby is born, so you imagine you've got a mum who's pregnant and a baby. This is the baby born, right? Mm-hmm. When the baby is born, it's much brighter than what the average person on Earth is.
That's true.
Okay? Because it has less damage.
Yes.
And therefore it is much brighter in terms of its spiritual condition.
Yes.
It is so bright that these spirits cannot see the body, the spirit body of that child. Do you understand?
I do.
So it is the spirit body of the child, when it first comes to earth, is so bright that a dark spirit who's in the hells, and all of these spirits will be in the hells at some point, cannot see the spirit body of that child. And so it thinks the child does not have a spirit body. And because it thinks the child does not have a spirit body and it can see the physical body, it thinks that the physical body has been created for them to reincarnate into. That's what these spirits think. And we had and if you want to listen to it, it might be 2 years ago now. Is it? I can't remember. August last year. There is a session where Mary is channeling some of these spirits, and it's translated, so you have to put up with the fact that it's translated from Portuguese. Mary is channeling some of these spirits who believe that the body that's created was a vessel. They called it a vessel for their reincarnation. And the reason why they called it that was they could not see the spirit body of the child connected to that physical body, because the spirit body of the child was so bright that they couldn't see it. Right? So there's many spirits who believe in reincarnation. There is no spirits in the celestial sphere who believe in reincarnation. Not single one.
So now,
As it's taught on Earth.
so I'd like some help, and I hope this won't sound offensive. Well, okay, sounds.
I don't
offensive.
care whether you offend me or not.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I want you to explain. I want you to explain you to me.
Remember to hold your mic like this so everyone can hear.
Okay.
That's it.
And so you're not here with a crown of thorns and a donkey and long robes. So explain to
Exactly.
me how there's no reincarnation in your Jesus.
I've said there's no reincarnation like is described here,
Okay.
right? And so when people refer to a reincarnation, they normally think of this process,
Okay.
right? Because this is what's taught on Earth. And what I'm saying is that entire thing is all false. That's what I'm saying. And I know that's challenging for some of you because you believe it, but it's actually false. So what actually happened?
Yes. Yes.
Is what you're
that's
asking.
it. Thank you.
I have to explain to you what didn't happen. So that's what happened. And this is why I'm loath to call it reincarnation, because the problem is that everybody, when they hear the word reincarnation, assumes that. And that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is this. Myself and Mary, we were created just like all other human souls. In other words, God, so this is God, created our soul, of which I am one half. I am the masculine half, and Mary is the feminine half. In the 2,000 years ago, we incarnated for the very first time. So we never had any previous incarnation. We incarnated for the very first time. The way I incarnated is my mum and dad, Mary and Joseph, had a baby. Well, they conceived a child, a male one. And because it was a male child, I could connect to that body. So they conceived, so I'll just write my half of the soul there, they conceived two bodies. They conceived, and everybody who ever conceives two bodies. They conceive a spiritual body and a physical body. Does that make sense? So far? Now that happened around 3 to 4 BCE for me. So that happened, and it wasn't Christmas time, by the way. It was around August, September that it happened, and that's when I became. I was born in August, September. I was conceived around Christmas time, about December. Yeah, but I was born in around August, September. Okay. Now that was my half of the soul that had its incarnation. Now, around 4 years later, Mary's half of our soul followed me around a bit, and around 4 to 5 years later, Mary found some parents who also conceived a female body that she could connect to. And so they created two bodies, a spirit body and a physical body, for her to connect to. So there we go. Now Mary's on earth, so this is Mary, and this is me. I was named Yeshua. Mary was named Miriam, right? Okay? So that was us in the first century. So we're now on earth. Now my mum and dad, Mary and Joseph, had other children, of course, like you used to in the first century. There was not much... contrary to popular opinion, there was contraception, but it was quite convoluted. You had to get the gut of sheep and make a prophylactic, basically, out of sheep gut and bow, and then wear that in order to prevent contraception. Now, of course, most men wouldn't do that because to do that meant they'd rather have 3 or 4 wives than do that, right? And keep them all pregnant. And so the treatment of women in the first century was quite poor. And so what they'd do is treat women as basically a possession. And many men had many wives per man, so that they could just have sex all the time or whenever they wanted. But in my mum and dad's case, that wasn't the case. My dad they were in love with each other, and they stayed together the entire time, and they didn't have sex with anyone else. They were monogamous in their relationship, and they didn't have. My father didn't have other wives. Right? But I had 5 brothers, 2 sisters. Okay, and Mary had 1 sister. So anyway, we've got the 2 of us now. We've now incarnated for the first time. We had a life experience. During this life experience, I found out about divine love and receiving God's love. So during that life experience on earth, I eventually became at one with God in terms of a process, which I can define later perhaps. But that might not have happened. And if that didn't have happened, we would have passed, like normal people, passed over into the spirit world. We both passed into the spirit world, just as everybody else does. So this is all happening on earth. And then after we passed, I passed, and because of my spiritual condition of love, and so you could say my condition of love, I passed into the 10th dimension. And if we count it back, 1, 2, 3, there is the 7th dimension, the 8th dimension, 8, 9, 10. So there's the 8th dimension here. And this is the 7th. And I made that transition from a spiritual perspective, from a love perspective, while I was on earth. I made that at the time of my baptism, just before my baptism actually. I decided to mark the occasion by getting baptised by John. Right? But I made this transition of love. So I entered into the 10th dimension. Now, Mary had a lot of very terrible things happen to her in her life. I did too, but Mary had much worse things happen to her than I did. And as a result, Mary continued living on earth for an additional nearly 30 years after my death. During that time, she improved her condition and she passed 1, 2, 3 into the 3rd dimension. And she was tortured to death like I was, but she was tortured in a much longer period of time than I was. And so she passed with quite a lot of pain initially, and that she had to work her way through. But eventually what happened is that Mary and I both worked to this condition, and we continued working up until we hit a state which happens, a transition that happens. There's many transitions that happen up here, by the way, but the transition I'd like to describe happens between the 35th and the 36th dimension, which is a transition from being separate as souls to being one as a soul. The spirits who have now gone through the transition, and there's only a few, call it the soul union state. Does that make sense? Now, any time up until the soul union state, you need your spirit body to express yourself. So in the spirit world, you have your soul and your spirit body still. So I had my soul and my spirit body, and Mary had her soul and her spirit body. Make sense? You only lose your physical body when your physical body dies. Everything you remember is the same as before, with the exception that you don't have a physical body. That's all. So all death is just you've lost your physical body. That's it. You don't become any more enlightened than you are right now.
Yeah, one of my teachers always said, just because you're dead doesn't mean you're smart.
That's right. In fact, for many of them, it means they're dumber, actually, for many, unfortunately. And it's not a funny thing, it's because there is so little the majority of us learn on earth about the spirit world that by the time we enter the spirit world, we know so little about it that it's almost like we're starting again. And that's how it is.
Like starting in kindergarten or
Yep.
nursery school.
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of us are actually, when we arrive in the spirit world thinking we know everything, we only know a lot of things about what happens on earth, and even then our knowledge is not as complete as what we would think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we pass into the spirit world and where our spirit and our physical body is left behind, while we're in a spirit body, we now know very little. And in fact, for many of them, they feel so totally confused about that they want to be on earth instead of being in the spirit world. And that's what you call earthbound spirits.
Mm-hmm.
The person who's earthbound wants to be on earth because they're so scared about being in the spirit world because they know nothing about it. Oh. Nothing at all. Mm-hmm. They know they died, and even many don't know that because they look at their body, they can still touch it. They can still touch, the spirit body can touch itself just like the physical body can touch itself. So when you're in the spirit world and you're touching yourself, you think you're a physical person still. It's only when you start walking through different people who are on earth that you realise, well, something's going on. Does that make sense? And it might sound funny, but that's how many people work out they must have died. You know, they walk up to someone and start saying, oh, and the person walks straight through them. And you imagine the very first time that happened to you and you thought you were a human on earth still, what would you think? You'd freak out, right? What went on there? And then you'd stick yourself in front of other people, walk straight. And then you stick yourself in front of other people and bang, you hit them. You go, what's going on now? Why do you hit them?
You'd feel like no one was noticing you.
You do feel like no one's noticing you. In fact, a lot of them feel really angry because all the people that they used to talk to before won't even listen to them anymore. Yeah, they can't hear them anymore, of course. So they get very angry about that and resentful and say, what's wrong with you? You know, and they get angry and even try to punish some of the people just because they're angry about not getting listened to, right? But the people they bash up against, they start to realise, they've passed over just like I have. You see, they've got the same body. When you've got the same type of body, you're solid to each other. And when you've got a different type of body, it's like one can walk through the other. So because they're both the same body, they start realising, what happened to you? Oh, well, the last thing I remember was I saw this truck coming towards me. That's it. I can't remember anything else. The other guy says, well, the last thing I remember was they were wheeling me in to have an operation for cancer. Can't remember anything else. You know? And then they both go, well, let's go and check out what happened with our family. So they go down to check out the family. And the family's all crying. And then they find out why they're crying. It's because they're dead. They're crying. And they go, I'm not dead. Why are you crying? And the family doesn't know that, of course, so they're still crying in grief, thinking the person has died. But the person who's looking at it's going, what's going on? And so they try to connect to them, but that doesn't work. And in fact, sometimes they try to connect to them, but it just makes their grief even worse. And so they don't bother doing that. And so they now know they died. So they're now in the spirit world, just like myself and Mary were. In the spirit world, we've got a spirit body and our soul is still connected, our half of the soul. And then as we progressed in love, we progressed to the point where we could merge our soul again back to its complete state. Does that make sense? In other words, Mary and I became one soul again, rather than two halves. It's the transition between these dimensions, that occurs. Now, there's other transitions that occur before then, like you have transitions in terms of what you can do, in terms of the power you have. You have transitions in terms of how much love you can express. You have transitions. There's transitions here that you make, and after you've made them, you can create a lot of bodies and express yourself through 3 or 4 or 5 of them at the same time, 10 of them, hundreds of them. And in this state, you can express yourself through hundreds of thousands of them at the same time if you wanted to. But I don't know why you would want to, but if you want to, you could. Because you've got the power to create spiritual bodies as well as physical bodies by just pulling together matter and getting rid of matter. Called materialization of matter and the dematerialization of matter. So after I died in the 1st century, I appeared to almost 500 people. And the way I did that, and Mary was the first person I appeared to, the way I did that was by materializing a physical form, which I animated with my own character and self, and I gave Mary a hug. and talk to her after I died, so she knew I was alive. And then others who weren't that convinced that anything I was talking about was true, I went to them as well and did the same thing. Talked to them and interacted with them. And sometimes I made a body that had holes in it so that they could at least conceive intellectually that I was the person who was hung, just to show them that I was still alive. Right? But of course that happens to every person who passes. Every person who passes is still alive. They're just in a spirit body, that's all. Most people who pass, though, have no way of producing a material body because their condition of love is not great enough to sustain the power of it. So historically, I've been the only person who's been able to pass and produce a material body within days of my passing. Does that make sense? Everyone else has taken usually years or tens or generations to do that, generally. Because you have to be in a fifth sphere condition to do it. You have to be in the fifth dimension at least to be able to provide that kind of power. Anyway, this is the process we went through. So we went through this process of union. Now, the reason why we had to do that before we returned to Earth is because at this point we had spiritual bodies still. Now, the only way to come back to Earth is to come back to as a child or to materialise. Now, I'd materialised many times, and that's not a very effective way of teaching much truth, to be frank. I tried teaching a lot of truth to people after I passed, and it wasn't a very effective way because all it taught them was I was still alive, but it didn't help them very much because my condition was so different to theirs. It just made them feel terrible sometimes, like when I appeared to them. So it's not a very effective way of teaching truth. So what we decided, and it was a decision we made when we were here, and we arrived there first in the year 1935. That's how long it took us to get from the time in the first century after our death through to that condition in terms of growth in love. Remember, it's all about love, growing in love, and accepting new truth from God. It's all about that. And that's how long it took us to... We thought it was possible for some time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, that it was possible to come back. But that was the first time we could actually do it. But we decided to wait until 6 other pairs, 6 other souls, had reached the same condition. And that took another 30 years nearly. It took another 27 years for the next 6 souls to reach the same condition. That make sense? So now, in the year 1962, we have 7 souls in the union condition in that state. Before then, there's no other people in that state. There's just the 7 souls. And what we decided collectively is that we wanted to come back to Earth. And we knew now that we could do it because now we didn't need this spiritual body. We were in a union state and we could connect to, we learned how to connect to the 2 bodies that were created by a new mother and father. And so what we decided to do was go through, the 14 of us, the 7 pairs, decided to go through the same process again to come back to Earth. I started the process in 1962. And then there was a series of people that continued the process, and the youngest of the 14 who are now on Earth are around 26 years of age at the moment. So that's the youngest of them. Now, you haven't met any of them because many of them are pretty upset about coming back to Earth. Right? They have a lot of anger to work their way through. They've got a lot of sadness to work their way through, a lot of grief, a lot of fear as well. A lot of them, all of them are fairly terrified about having come back. And they've had to work their way through those emotions. The question is, why do they have those emotions? Well, because the parents who created our new bodies, so if we look at our current day, a lady called Maxine, which is my mother, in this life, and my father called Alan. Of course, they also had sex. And they produced a child, me. I'm their firstborn. Right? It's my body. But in this case, instead of having a newly connected body like I did in the first century, I decided to connect to it from here. Does that make sense? So there's two bodies. There's two bodies that were created by my mum and dad. Still a spirit body and a physical body. And I decided to connect to them from that location. But the emotions of my mum and dad were always going to be present. And therefore, as soon as I connected to them, the emotions from my mum and dad would flow back into me. Do you follow? And as soon as that happened, every single one of my memories got tainted by the emotional condition. So that's why I've had to work through emotions in this life. Because every single one of my memories for the last 2,000 years are now filtered through the emotion of my mum and dad. So my mum has a lot of fear. So I've had to have all of my memories filtered through lots of fear. So things that I thought were good before I came feel bad now because I've got fear about it to feel my way through. Now, I've started that process of feeling those emotions 17 years ago. Right? And for the last 10 years, I've been doing it conscious of my own identity, conscious that I know who I am because of what I remember. Does that make sense? Mary's been doing it for 6 years. Cornelius has been doing it for probably as long as I have almost, haven't you? But not yet fully doing it with a consciousness of your own identity. Yeah. And the others are not doing it at all at this point in time. When I say not at all, they're not doing it consciously at all. In other words, they still have the law of attraction events that trigger their emotions, but they don't choose to address those particular things. Does that make sense? But for myself, I chose to do that. I started the process 17 years ago, and I chose to do it consciously for the last 10 years. Right? And so in the process of doing that, I remember more and more and more of my life. And now I remember a large amount of my life. So I remember a large amount of my life in the first century, a large amount of my life in the spirit world. And I remember, of course, what the average person remembers about their life in this life. But my soul is not a new soul. It's the same soul that lived here 2,000 years ago and lived all the way through the spirit world. And therefore I have a memory of all of these events. Does that make sense? And the reason why I can speak with you with conviction about what happens in terms of emotionally, what happens in the universe and what happens in all these other aspects without having to think about it is because I remember it. Mm-hmm. So it's easy for me to speak about it. It's not something I have to learn. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Whereas for the person in their first incarnation, they have to learn it. Which of course means going through the experience of it, which is a much more difficult process than remembering it. Although all of my memories go through all of the emotions of my parents. So that is my difficulty now. My difficulty now is having to go through every single memory that I have through the filters of my parents' emotions.
Well, don't we all have that difficulty in that whatever we're doing, we have until we start to dismantle it through one process or another, dismantle our parents' emotions, which aren't necessarily anything that we resonate with or...
I agree. But the difference is I have good memories about some things that feel bad. You don't have good memories about things that feel bad. You have good memories about good things and bad memories about bad things. Do you understand the difference? I have good, for example, I remember making the transition between these dimensions. When I did that, because I was the first person to make the transition in each dimension, I felt like you entered a new dimension. It's like a new universe. You imagine the universe the size of this universe that gets created every time that you enter a new dimension, right? These dimensions are coexistive in the sense they exist in the same space, but they are newly created forms of matter that occur because of your change in your condition of love. So I remember these changes and what caused them. And I remember being there as the only person there. So imagine entering the entire universe and you're the only person in it. Right? Now, for me, it felt really good at the time because I was already at one with God. I knew where Mary was. I could always go back and visit her at any time I wanted to, and I did most of the time. And as a result, it was just beautiful all the time, learning new things. However, through my memories of my mother and father's loneliness, now when I have the memory, I cry because it feels alone, like I was alone all the time.
Oh,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I
It
understand.
feels like every new dimension I went into, I was alone again. Every another dimension I go into. So it felt to me like progression meant I was always going to be alone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that probably feels that way to a lot that people feel.
I agree, but for a different reason.
Yeah,
Right?
okay.
So, but for me, a good experience turns out now to feel bad. And unless I'm willing to go through the feelings, I'll shut it down. And therefore I won't remember. Remember, you only remember things that you're willing to emotionally accept. So, for example, for yourselves, many of you haven't remembered events from your childhood because you are unwilling to emotionally accept what happened in the event. Right? Your memory is dependent upon your emotional acceptance of events.
And so when you don't have memory, or for those of us that don't have memory, it's because we're blocking the emotional experience that
Correct.
those two things. Can I go back to the first century for just a minute?
Sure?
Did you go to India?
No.
So that's just a story that someone told, or how?
There were only two, well, in my opinion, in my concept of first century life, there were three countries I visited. One of them is not recognised as a country nowadays. But I was in Egypt from the time of shortly after my birth to the time that I was nearly 13 years of age. And I was in the Nazareth, which is obviously Israel, from the time of 13 years of age through to the time of my becoming at one with God. And then I travelled around Israel mostly, but I did occasionally go into Samaria, occasionally, which is now what you'd classify, I suppose, as Syria, in that region on the right hand, which is the east of the of the Galilee and the Jordan. Yeah. Oh, so it'd be Jordan and Syria now. I also travelled through those areas in the first century, but they weren't called Jordan and Syria then, of course. So they are the areas that I travelled. I didn't travel anywhere else in the world. Yeah. I travelled by foot mostly, so you can understand why I didn't travel anywhere else in the world. There was no airplanes or anything, and we didn't carry around a lot of possessions with us. We did have at one point animals, but we wouldn't use animals to carry our possessions because we felt it wasn't fair on the animal. And so myself and Mary generally walked around with everything on our back. And so we're basically hikers, right, if you thought about it nowadays.
So did you have 12 people that went around with you?
No. We had hundreds of people who went around with us. And most of them were women, actually, or a lot of them were. There was you say that probably around, there were what are classified as the 12 apostles now, are all men, right? Yeah, well, men had the least understanding in the first century of what I taught. So, well, they were often abusive towards women, so they didn't understand how I treated Mary. In fact, Peter, so-called Apostle Peter, raped Mary 2 days after I died. That shows you how little understanding he had about how I felt about Mary, right? And so, and a lot of the other disciples, John had a good understanding, but he was just a friend. Like, they were all just friends. Why would they all be called apostles now, do you think? It's pretty obvious, because some church wanted to create a male-based leadership. You know, it's pretty obvious what's going on, isn't it? And the reality is, on earth, when we lived on earth, men were dominant. Like, men basically viewed women as possessions. So of course that was going to happen after we passed. Yeah. But no, there were no 12 apostles. There are a lot of people who were interested in the teachings of divine truth in the first century. We used to call it the way to God. And as a result, those people followed us wherever they could. There was no recordings to listen to. So if they wanted to hear what I had to say, they had to be there. Does that make sense? They couldn't choose not to be there if they wanted to hear. So what they did was they followed us around, and anybody who could afford to do so did that. Yeah. Or if they were a woman, if they were either a single woman, they did it. But if they were a married woman, they had to get the permission of their husbands to do it. But a lot of the husbands gave their permission, and some of the married women followed us around too. And eventually, members of my family followed us around, like, you know, Thomas the Doubter, that you might call him. Well, he's one of my brothers, and he followed me around eventually. He didn't at the start, but he did eventually. My mum followed me around eventually. My father didn't. He thought my mum was crazy doing it, but that's how it was. My father was a Pharisee. He was on the Sanhedrin the night I was murdered. Yeah. My father was a Pharisee, and he was on the Sanhedrin, which is a group of 70 men who decide the fate of a Jewish person by law. And I was brought before the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night, obviously. It was not a full Sanhedrin. It's a bit like your government here, you know, how they get to have a quorum of, you know, a certain number of people. And as long as those people are there, they can vote on any subject and make it law. Well, it's the same sort of principle in the first century sort of thing. And as a result, there was only 40 or so people present on the Sanhedrin the night I died, but my father was actually present. He was there when I was condemned to death. He didn't agree with the condemnation, but he was there.
So the story that you were killed by the Romans, that's not accurate either?
No, I was killed by the Romans.
Oh, you were killed by the
Romans. Yeah, I was killed by the Romans. I was passed from Pilate back to Herod, and then back to Pilate, because by Roman law, the Jews could not kill any Roman citizen. And because Rome had conquered the Jewish area, everyone was classified as Roman citizens, so by law, the Jews could not kill a Roman citizen. They had to get the agreement of Rome, or the representative of Rome, in order to kill anyone. So that's why Herod passed me back to Pilate, and Pilate wanted to free me, actually. But there was another man named Jesus as well. He wasn't named Barabbas, as the Bible says. His name was Jesus. Jesus was a common name in the first century. And so there were two of us Jesuses on trial. One had committed murder. He was like a terrorist nowadays. And one was myself. And Pilate said, which one of these do you want to free? And the Jewish high priests and the priests, the members of the Sanhedrin, said, we want to free Jesus Barabbas, the murderer, rather than Jesus, the preacher. Yep. So that's basically how I died. Yeah. Of course I died because people didn't want their money to go away. You understand?
The people didn't want, I'm sorry.
Well, the Sanhedrin stood to lose a lot of money. What happened was, in the first century, the way government was run was there was a temple tax. And the temple tax was, I think at the time, two gold coins. And every person who was a member of the Jewish religion had to pay it. And there used to be people from the temple going around collecting this tax. And this tax meant that almost 4 tons of gold entered the high priest's control every single year. So you imagine, in terms of today's money, how much that was. You're talking billions of dollars, right? Of gold would enter the high priest's control every single year. Now, the more I preached, the more danger there was that less people would pay the tax, which meant that there'd be less gold going into the high priest's coffers. And this also meant that there'd be less gold going to Pilate, because Pilate used to filter off some gold from the high priest. And Pilate did that. He didn't send this gold to Rome. He kept that for himself. So a lot of procurators did that in that time. They used to go to an outlying country where there was still Roman government, but not. It was hard for Caesar to see what was going on. And what they would do is they would siphon off a lot of the cash and give some of the cash to Caesar and keep some for themselves. Right? So both Pilate and the high priest now had a lot of money to lose if my teachings grew to such an extent that people no longer believed in the Jewish faith. Because if they no longer believed in the Jewish faith, they'd no longer go to the temple. They'd no longer get sacrifices for their sins, because now they'd realise that they didn't need to sacrifice anything for their sins. They needed to be more obedient to law instead. Mm-hmm. And once they started realising these particular things, they would probably not attend the temple and therefore not pay the tax.
So when they understood divine truth, these trappings would be just that. I mean, the other things would be just trappings.
Yeah, these are it's huge amount of wealth mm-hmm. that they stood to lose mm-hmm. if my teachings grew any further than they already had grown. Because by this stage, there were thousands of people coming along to my seminars. Well, that's what you'd call them nowadays, right? A seminar. We did it on the side of the Galilee or on the side of, the Jordan or something like that.
So what about loaves and fishes and raising the dead and...
Well, firstly, with all of those miracles, they're all good questions. I've answered all these questions in the FAQ on my identity, by the way. But just to give you a bit of a summary. The loaves and the fishes, I never did. So I didn't eat fish. Like, I don't eat meat. I didn't eat meat from the age of 13 in the first century, so I'm certainly not going to multiply fish for other people to eat when I didn't eat it myself. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It was a legend that got created through word of mouth, as many legends do, mm-hmm. that had no bearing on what actually happened. What actually happened was that people brought along their food with them, and then we decided to have a great big get-together like we do nowadays, and everybody's food gets put together, and there's so much food left over that...
So it was the potluck of the loaves and fishes.
Exactly. It was the potluck. Yeah, I understand that's what you guys call it. What do we call it in Australia? We don't. We just call it bring a plate, we call it. Yeah. But yeah, that's basically what it was. The potluck of the first century life got turned into a legend. Mm-hmm. I never walked on water. I never turned water into wine. If I had my personal preference, I'd rather turn wine into water.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Mind you, turning wine into water can be done by anybody with a bit of titration, but so it's not a great miracle. But turning water into wine, of course, that would prove quite a miracle, but I don't know why I'd want to do it, and I certainly wouldn't want to do it myself. I don't see any purpose for it. I did heal people from illnesses. So I did heal people who were blind, sick, lame, had leprosy, and all of the healings were instantaneous.
And you healed them how?
Well, I didn't really heal them. I was just a conduit for God's expression of love to the individual. And if the person had faith, they would have an openness in their soul. And so that love would flow into them, and God would use my ectoplasm in my body to heal them, basically. Mm-hmm. That's how it happened. So I didn't really do it. It was completely under the control of God's will, if you like. But I was in harmony with God's will, so anybody I felt to heal, God also felt to heal. And I could only heal the people who had at least some level of faith that they could be healed. Does that make sense?
Right, they had to be willing to receive.
They had to be willing to receive, but they also had to have a feeling that they could receive.
Could receive.
As well, yes. And so I healed all it, but I did not raise from the dead as many people interpret it to be. every person that I so-called raised from the dead were basically in a state of what you would call suspended animation, I suppose, is the best
Or
terminology
coma
for
or
it.
something? Or-
But let me define that. It's not really suspended animation. This is what actually happens. You've got your spirit body and you've got your physical body and your soul. Now, when a person dies, there's a transition where there's a cord between these two bodies that join them together, physically join them together. And all of the energy systems and all the memories and everything else come from your brain and go into the mind of the spirit body and into the cord that actually animates the spirit body. And this cord starts from the base of your spine and goes up to your hypothalamus in your brain, and it connects all of the spirit body to the physical body. So it's sort of like a robotic cord that allows the spirit body to animate the physical body. Does that make sense? Now, this cord is called the silver cord, and the reason why it's called that is because to a spirit it looks like it's a silver in colour. Right? Now, what happens when a person dies is this cord has to completely snap in order for death to be completed. If the cord does not snap, in other words, there is a connection maintained through the physical body and the spiritual body. If the cord doesn't snap instantly, and that could happen for a lot of different reasons, then the cord stays in place for a period of time. Now, the longest I've ever seen the cord stay in place was 3 days. And that was the longest I've ever seen it. I don't know if it's longer, and that was with my friend Lazarus. Lazarus had his cord stayed for nearly 3 days. He was wrapped up. Everyone thought he was dead. He wasn't breathing. He was wrapped up, bound up, put inside of a tomb, and the temperature of the tomb kept his body in a pretty good state. And because the spirit body was still animating his physical body, no decomposition occurred at all, right? But usually after 3 days, decomposition would occur, right? Because if a person was completely dead, decomposition would begin in the body and it would be quite smelly. And this is why people around said, oh, look, he's going to be really smelly. Why do you want to open the tomb for? Right? But I knew that he wasn't dead and therefore he wouldn't be smelly, right? Because his spirit body was still animating his physical body because the cord hadn't broken yet. And so all I had to do was help him reanimate his body properly. Does that make sense? And once I did that, he could walk out of the tomb. What actually happened is we unwrapped him and he walked out of the tomb. Because when he was all bound up it was pretty hard for him to unwrap himself, right? So we unwrapped him and he walked out of the tomb. That's all it was. It wasn't a resurrection. Because if this cord had snapped, there would have been nothing I could have done. Nothing. Now, every other so-called resurrection in the Bible is the same. That's what I did. I knew that the connection was still occurring. And it's a bit like a doctor nowadays. Doctors generally know or have a feeling the connection is still there. And that's why they put the paddles on people to revive them. Or that's why they do heart-lung resuscitation, right? During that period of time, the person's died clinically. They're not breathing, but actually there is still energy animating their physical body and the soul hasn't left. The spirit body hasn't left. And doctors usually can feel that even. And so they put the paddles on, try to revive the person. But eventually they get to the point where they know, we can't revive this person's actually died, right? And during that period of time, you can revive any person, pretty much, as long as you have energy to do so. Now, that energy can come from you, or it can come from some electromechanical device, but you can revive the individual. Yeah? And that's why doctors have learnt about resuscitation now, because they've learnt that you can revive a person during that period of time. But once a person is actually dead and the silver cord is broken, revival is not possible. Does that make sense? So every resurrection in the first century, the silver cord was still in place. And all I was like a doctor who knew how to revive the body without having to have paddles and some kind of heart-lung resuscitation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
That's
does.
it.
Okay, but now what happens for people who think that they are communicating with spirits that are dead or that have died? If someone says they're...
Well, everyone can communicate with spirits, actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, right now you're communicating with some spirits.
Okay.
You don't know that, do you? Some of your
I
questions...
had a sneaking suspicion that I probably was, but no, I'm certainly not conscious of it.
Yeah, some of the spirits are suggesting your questions.
Oh.
Does that make sense?
Yeah?
Yeah, you can feel sometimes the suggestion where you feel almost impelled that you've got to ask. Almost impelled that you've got to ask, right?
So was someone playing with us right now?
Of course, but that's normal, right, in my seminars. So many of your questions even, there's a group of spirits around you who are Christians who have never understood some basic principles about my first century life.
Uh-huh.
They're now considering asking me the questions because before they wouldn't have even considered it. They would just feel that it's impossible, so they wouldn't have even asked these questions. But now they feel inclined to ask them. And they felt that you're pretty open to asking them, so they've been feeding you some of these questions and you've been doing the right thing and furthering them on. And this is very common. So most of the questions that get asked in our audiences are not asked by the people in our audiences. They're usually from spirits.
Well, when I started on my spiritual quest, which I had not intended to start on, I got a Quran, a Bible, teachings of Buddha,
Yep.
and Bhagavad Gita, and
Yep.
I lined them up in a row.
Yes.
And I'd read a chapter from each one, and I figured that if anything showed up in all four, it was maybe worth paying attention to. And I'm sure that's a more laborious way of going at things than...
It's a pretty laborious way, but actually logical.
Well, just because something is logical doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, but it's...
Well, no, it's logical, laborious, but logical.
Okay.
Yes.
But anyway, it seems to me that a lot of Christians haven't actually read the Bible. It's not a very nice book,
Correct.
I don't think. And I've read it a number of times, and my belief is that it's the history of the Kali Yuga, but that's my opinion of it. So there's some truth in it, but it certainly doesn't seem to me like it would be something to base your life on.
Correct. There are many things in it you can base your life on if you interpret it properly. But yes, you're right. Every one of these books, in fact, is material that has been usually channeled in some way to people on earth, and it contains both truth and error. The trick is knowing how to tell the difference.
Yes, well, I would like to have the answer to that trick.
Yeah? Do you know how the trick is, how to tell the difference?
To be willing to stay with my feelings and feel all of them.
True, but the best way is... What you do is you put love up there, and then you read a scripture from the Bible. You know, you might read like 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. You know what that says?
I don't know scripture and verse.
No. Most people haven't read the Bible. Even who are Christians haven't read it. So most people, when I say that, they wouldn't even know what that verse says. And then you might read something from the Quran. And I can't quote the actual verses actually in the Quran. Now, if I compare with love and I go 1 John 4:18, what does it say? Okay, this is what it says. There is no fear in love.
Oh, I like that.
Love throws fear aside. How's that feel?
Yeah.
So would we have 100% agreement on that subject? So I would go, yeah, that's a great verse. That's definitely a truth. I can feel that truth. Do you feel tingles sometimes? You feel the tingles that sometimes happen when the truth happens?
Yes.
Some of you felt that while I wrote that out. That's a part of this process. It's like an emotional acknowledgement. Wow, that's an amazing verse. It is an amazing verse, isn't it? How many Christians practice that? Would you go to war if you're a Christian if you knew that?
No.
I don't think so, because fear creates war. There's no fear in love. So if you truly loved your brother, and Jesus, according to the Bible, not me, according to the Bible, and this is in Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 6, Matthew chapter 7, it says that you should love even your enemy.
Yeah.
So if there is no fear in love and you should love your enemy, then would you go to war? Never. You'd even die before you go to war, wouldn't you? Under those. And there's no fear in love. So if you're in love, you wouldn't even be afraid of dying. Can you see that? It's a very powerful verse, that, isn't it? So I would put a tick next to that one. And I'd say, that sounds to me like divine truth. That sounds to me like God's truth. Okay. Now, there's another verse. I'll paraphrase this one because it's too long to write. It's in Revelation, chapter 19. It says something along these lines. That God will come with an avenging fire and with the plagues and destroy all of those who do not believe. How many tingles did you get from that one? Not many. Does that sound like in harmony with love to you?
No.
No. So what I would do with that one? I'd throw it out. All right? Now, if you do that with everything you read, you'll determine truth pretty rapidly. Not just with Bibles or Quran or the holy books like the Gita or any other book, the Hindu faith or the Buddhist faith. If you just did that with everything, even a book you picked up from Dr. Wayne Dyer or, by the way, much of what he says is quite loving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like reading his stuff. It's quite good. Right? And the reason why is because when love is present, if you use it as your measuring stick to measure all truth, you'll have a very great ability to determine what the truth is. Right? But when love is not present, and it might even only be your definition of love at this point in time, by the way, which might grow over time. You've got to realise that too. But it's pretty obvious, isn't it? A scripture like that, it's pretty obvious to me. And I don't know, it seems pretty obvious to me that almost anybody in any condition would read that and go, wow, that's a pretty profound statement. And therefore must be a pretty profound truth because it's totally in harmony with love, isn't it? Totally in harmony with love. So to me, what you could do is you could read the Bible if you wanted to and determine every single verse that's out of harmony with love and in harmony with love. And that what you could do is you could write down the verses that were in harmony with love and make a list. And then you could get all the ones that are out of harmony with love, push them all aside, get all the ones in harmony with love and make a book out of them. And that one would be much closer to God's word than the one we have.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, totally.
Yeah. And if we chose to do that, you could see that if everybody chose to do that with their own books, you could see that in the end, it's highly likely that all humanity would come to a similar opinion about many things, about love, through that process. Yeah. So that's what I recommended people to do in the first century, to test everything from the perspective of love. Just test everything from that perspective. Love is the thing that will determine what the truth is in the end. And this makes sense, doesn't it? If you imagine, here we've got the universe. I'm pretty clever because I fitted it on one board. And so this is and it's round. God exists, and even that's a hard thing to draw. God exists outside of the universe.
Really?
You know how I know that? Because when the universe didn't exist, God still existed.
Oh.
Right? So God's existence is independent of the universe. That makes sense, doesn't it, logically? Yeah. And I know it also because I've looked all through the universe and not seen any God in it. But I do feel God and I know where God exists. So God is outside of the universe which God created. Do you follow? That being the case, God created this universe. Now, God's only attributes that I am aware of primarily start with love. So to me, that indicates that every single law, remember this universe is governed completely by law. There's physical laws, such as the law of aerodynamics, law of gravity, those kind of laws. There's spiritual laws, which are physical in their nature. So in the spirit world, there are physical, scientific laws that govern the operation of what you can do. There are certain parts you can't go to unless you've got a certain amount of love, for example. And it's laws that govern that. Law governs the entire universe in every dimension. Even in the hells, law governs that universe. God's laws are all loving, so they're all loving laws. So what that tells me is if the universe is governed by loving laws, then anything that's truth also has to be loving. Anything that's God's truth has to be loving. Anything that's not loving cannot be God's truth. So if I then compare a book, such as the Bible, to this beautiful universe that God's created that's all loving, and ask myself, how is loving law involved in these verses? Sometimes I'll find a verse that there is loving law involved.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's a verse in Proverbs that says, if you spare the rod, you'll spoil the child. That's a paraphrase of that verse. Now, if you spare the rod, meaning that you beat the child, does that feel loving? I don't like to be beaten as an adult, and I'm pretty certain a child doesn't like to be beaten. And I know when I was a child, there was one time when I was belted. Most of the rest of the time I was invisible. When I say invisible, nobody saw me because basically I did everything everybody else wanted. But there were a few times when I didn't do that and I got belted. And I didn't like it. I don't know about you. Did you like it at the time? Did you like it? Weren't you frightened, scared? Right? Weren't you like crying the pain or trying to not cry because that means humiliation or whatever it is? Now, of course, to me that means, right, spare the rod, spoil the child. That means, okay, it's encouraging me to hit my child with a rod. Now, I can't agree that that's loving, no matter what way I look at that. However, if you interpret the word rod to mean restrictions, or if you interpret the word rod to mean loving restrictions, if you spare loving restrictions, you will spoil the child. How does that sound to you? That sounds pretty true to me, actually. Does that make sense? If I spare loving restrictions, I will spoil the child. In other words, if I give the child everything it wants, without any restrictions, eventually the child's going to grow up to be a person who's spoilt and selfish, and that's certainly going to spoil the child with regard to love. So I can see some truth in that. So even some of the verses, although at face value they might not be that truthful, you can see that with a little bit of self-analysis and a little bit of analysis of the verse, if you change a few of the words, you can see you can turn it into something truthful.
I had been taught that the rod was actually the crook on a stick that they used to guide the sheep. So it was meant that you would guide the child with this rod so it wouldn't go wandering off, which I think is the same thing that you're saying, or wouldn't, fall in a crevice. Or
Of course, like the kind of Christians do that. And it is true that the rod, which was like a staff like that, was used to hook sheep usually, and just pull them along in a certain direction, right? And that was, you could say that was the rod of discipline. In other words,
guidance.
And discipline
rather
comes from the word disciple. And what does the word disciple mean?
to follow, doesn't it?
No. It means taught one.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So the word discipline actually means one that is willing to teach. Offering disciplines means offering teachings.
Ah.
And the word disciple means taught one, a person who has been taught. Right? Now, of course, now we use the word discipline to mean spanking. But, you know, we have a lot of different issues about that. Now, of course, the average person might explain it that way, but to be frank, I don't know of a Christian religious faith on this planet that does not agree with spanking children. I don't know of one. I don't know if you've met
I
one.
think some of the churches are starting to modify themselves.
I feel they're starting to, but with a lot of resistance.
I actually went to a lecture at a church last night. I didn't tell the minister I was going to see Jesus today, but but he was talking about. He said, if I get something from my mind, it's no good, but when it comes from my heart, and I was like, wow, this isn't a Christian church. This is amazing. I mean, I'd gone for.
But there is another scripture in Jeremiah which says, right, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. Who can know it?
Yeah, that shows up in yoga too, but I'm not sure that I believe that.
Exactly. See, what I'm saying is a Christian who believes in what the Bible says, and only in what the Bible says, is going to agree with spanking their child, and just as much as they're going to agree that their heart is deceitful and who can know it. In other words, don't trust your heart. That's what that verse is saying.
But they do have, they now have the Unity and the New Thought churches that
I agree.
are looking at the scriptures and either...
I agree. I'm not condemning them.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that...
I know, the traditional
we
church...
have to do that.
Right.
We have to do that. If you take the traditional route, or if you think about it, it's almost a militant route with regard to the Bible, then of course the result is going to be that you're going to believe in spanking your children, going to war, killing people who don't believe what you believe, and so forth.
And converting everyone that doesn't talk exactly the way
By
you
force,
do.
yeah, converting everyone by force, yes. And of course, that's what the Bible says, but it's not what loving laws of God would say. Yeah. And this is what we need to come to understand, is if you judge everything, or if you look at everything through the fact that all of God's laws are loving, then you can determine truth very easily. And that's wonderful, knowing how to determine truth, isn't it? And so what I would do is I'd create 3 bins. This is what I do inside of myself. There's 3 baskets, I suppose you could call them, right? There's this is divine truth basket. Or if we want another name for divine truth, this is God's absolute truth. So this is the basket of God's absolute truth. Right? That's one basket. Then there's the basket of maybe truth. You could also call this the I don't know basket. Right? And then there's the basket of not truth. Right? We need to be very careful about moving anything from this basket. See what I'm saying? We need to be careful about moving anything away from have we determined whether it's true or not yet. You see, what mankind frequently does is they move things into that basket just by innuendo. Like, how many of you, when you first heard that Jesus was in Australia and on the internet, felt like that was true? When you first heard it? 0. How many of you thought about throwing that into the not truth basket straight away? Most of you, I would have to suggest, would have thought about throwing it into there, but then you had a pause, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You had a pause and you went, but maybe I should just find out. There was something that caused you to think, maybe I shouldn't just make this decision based on face value, isn't it? Otherwise you wouldn't even be here, right? So what you did was, instead of throwing it into the not truth basket, you kept it in the maybe truth basket. In other words, or if we make this basket more easier to understand, the I don't know basket. Right? That's what you did with it. You put it in the I don't know basket. That demonstrates your own open-heartedness and open-mindedness. Does that make sense? Because the average person doesn't do that. The average person just throws it in the basket without any evaluation, without any examination, without any consideration, just chuck it into that basket. Now, this basket is a very important basket because pretty much everything that's in the universe goes into that basket right at the start. Does that make sense? Because we don't know. We don't know about a lot of the universe. But eventually, we can come to know whether one thing is true or not. And how do we do that? So, for example, I've told you about spirits and how they overcloak people. How are you going to know that that happens? You have to go through something yourself, don't you, to know that for certain. Until that time, you're just trusting my word for it. And I'd suggest to you, trusting another person's word for anything is not a good way of determining truth. Right? What you need to do is determine it for yourself, through your own experiments, through your own examination, through your own consideration. That's what you need to do, right? Everyone needs to do this. So what you would need to do, really, is, right, you hear somebody present to you something, like I have in these last couple of days. What you would need to do is start examining it, wouldn't you? Now, remember the core examination principle. What is it? Love. So love is the way by which you examine everything. Does that make sense? So, anything you hear and you're not sure whether it's loving or not, you leave it in this basket. Anything you hear and you know for certain that it's definitely not loving, you put it in this basket. And anything you hear and you know for certain that it's a beautiful expression of love, you put it possibly in this basket. You don't know yet because your personal experience hasn't demonstrated that it's there, but it's a possibility that it goes there, isn't it? If it's in harmony with love. Now, the more you do that and allow yourself to experiment with these things that you don't know, the more truth you'll discover very rapidly as a result. But the fastest way of doing it is to compare it with love every time. So I look at this world's, the religious belief that is both in the Quran and in the Bible that says that you're allowed to spank your child, and in fact that you should, if you're going to keep control of your child. And I ask myself, is that loving? Is that, if I, and I ask myself this, would I like to be spanked? And I go, I don't go for that much. I'd personally like to be reasoned with. I'd even personally like to be restricted rather than spanked. So I'd rather somebody puts me in jail than beats me up, wouldn't you? If you had a choice between getting beaten up for a day and put in jail for a day, which one would you choose? I'm sure the average person would say put in jail for a day. Right? And to me, the restriction is far more loving than the beating. So for me, I would say, okay, here, love dictates this truth. This truth I'm being told is, what other people think is true, is you should spank your child. Love says to me, that's not the case. There's got to be another way to restrict your child's poor behaviour than spanking them. So to me, that teaching goes into this basket. Until somebody proves otherwise to me, that's where it's going to stay. Right? But then I get a teaching, a teaching come along that says something like, one person should pay for all of your sins. And I go, okay, let's say I'm the person that has to pay for everyone else's sins. Do I feel like doing that? No. I don't feel that's fair. It's certainly not loving to me that I have to pay for the sins. And then I reflect about it further and I go, imagine I had 2 children and I had a very unruly son and a very lovely son. And this lovely son, he was always wanting to do what was in harmony with love. And this very unruly child, he always wanted to hate and hurt people. And I had these 2 children. And somebody came along and said to me, you know what you should do? You should beat that son, the loving one, for everything that the unloving son did. And I'd look at them and go, are you nuts? You must be nuts, because that doesn't sound very fair for me. It doesn't sound fair to my loving son. Right? So already I'm starting to have the consideration that if they have this viewpoint that one person should pay for everyone's sins, or even for one other person's sin, I would have to put it in the not truth basket. Can you see? Because it doesn't feel very loving or just or any of those other things to me. Right? And it doesn't matter what theological presentation somebody makes to me who's studied religion for the last 50 years. At the end of the day, they're not going to be able to convince me that it's more loving than what I've assessed. Right? Now, unless somebody can come up with some logical explanation for such a decision, I would have to leave it in that basket. And then somebody comes along and says, you know, if you do the wrong thing on earth, and the wrong thing is defined as this, you just have to not accept that Jesus is your saviour. In other words, you have to reject Jesus being your saviour. If you just do that one thing wrong on earth, when you pass, you will be in hell for the rest of your existence. I'm going, you're joking me, right? It does not make any sense to me. How can that be loving? You mean I've just got to make one mistake, and it has to be that mistake of not trusting that Jesus is my saviour, and I am going to be tormented this torment is approved of, obviously, by God, because God's not rescuing me from it. And I'm going to be tormented by this devil who God has allowed to exist somehow in the universe, all because I made one choice out of harmony with what you believe. Does that sound loving to me? I don't know if that sounds loving to you, but to me, that goes in this basket. But if somebody said to me, you know, if you do bad things on earth and you decided you wanted to continue doing bad things on earth and you weren't sorry for what you did, when you pass into the spirit world, you're going to pass into a place that reflects what you did to you. And you'll stay in that place for as long as it takes for you to have a different reflection. You might stay there 10,000 years, or you might stay there 1 year. It just depends on whether you come to your senses and see what you did or not, by yourself. You have to do it by yourself. And if I think about that, I go, well, that's responsible. That talks about self-responsibility. It means I have to pay for things that I did wrong, but the way I pay is by coming to realise why I did those things wrong. So this sounds pretty fair to me. It sounds quite loving to me, that does. Right? And so what I would do is I would put it in the maybe it's that. Maybe it's that. Now, until it's my personal experience, I won't know for certain, but at least I'll have a good idea what to expect. Right? And this is the thing that we can do with all of these things in our life. Now, of course, there is one way that's a bit easier than all of that to determine truth. That sounded pretty logical, yes, to do? Yeah? Okay. So anybody could do that, couldn't they? And to be honest, I feel a lot of scientists and people who don't even believe in God do that more naturally than people who have belief systems. Yeah. But there is a better way to determine truth. But this is the way most people don't want to determine truth, but it is a better way. Have faith that there is a God. Have faith that God created your soul, along with your spirit body and your physical body. And have faith that that God, because he or she created you, wants to love you. And have faith that when you stop blocking this love from entering you and instead open yourself up through the exercise of your passionate longing for God's love, that this love will enter you under one condition. And that condition is as long as you are willing to get into harmony with truth. So right at this moment, if I'm not receiving love, then it means I'm not in harmony with truth. Now, for the majority of people, that's pretty much all the time. Right? So what we would do is when we start, we'd go, wow, I'm asking for love, but I'm not receiving any, so I mustn't be in harmony with truth. I need to find out what it is that I'm not in harmony with. That's all I need to do. And we can do that using the other method still, if we want to. But this tells me straight away that there's a lot out of harmony with truth. And there's times when you'll be in harmony with truth and you'll feel the love enter you and you'll be overwhelmed with emotion and you go, wow, I'm in harmony with truth right now. And you can ask anything in that moment and the flow of love will either stop or continue depending on the harmony of truth. So if you're connected to God all the time, and this is the beauty of striving for the effort to connect to God all the time. If you are connected to God all the time, and that place is called at one-ment with God, you will be able to ask any question on any subject in the universe and know what is truthful and not truthful. You'll be able to come up with ideas and instantly dismiss them or accept them based on the flow of God's love into your soul. When God's love's not flowing, the thing that you just thought of was not truthful. When God's love is flowing, the thing that you just thought of is truthful. It's really simple. And that's how a person in the celestial spheres discovers more truth. So they're still looking for truth, and they come up with ideas, and they come up with concepts, and they test them through this particular connection with God. And all we need to do is get that connection, and once we've got that connection, then we can do the same thing. The struggle we have is getting the connection. That's the struggle. Right? And that's all about opening your heart to this flow of love from God. The flow of love from God will transform you if you let it, but most of us don't let it. We don't let the transformation take place. We don't allow the flow of emotions, which is humility. We don't want to know the truth. We don't want to often be loving. We often don't want to use our will. We want other people to do things for us, and we often do not have any faith. And as a result of that, the flow of love is very difficult because we're not exercising our will for it to happen. But if we choose to do these things, this prayer process, remember this is prayer, that is prayer, will bring us the love from God that will transform our soul. And that really is the most important thing you could ever remember. So you know all these other questions we have, and I haven't answered quite a lot of them that people have given me. There's questions about whether there's extraterrestrials, and there's questions about, let me read some of these here if that's all right. There's questions about self-healing, Reiki. Did I use Reiki in the first century? Can you be a conduit for God? You know, what are the cause of, what is reptilians? What is the book Cosmic Price and Mary Magdalene? Is that any good? All of these questions can be answered by you. But only if you learn how to answer such questions. And how to answer such questions is what I've shown you here. And that's why it's so important to do it. Because it gives you this freedom to be able to determine truth in all its facets for the rest of your existence. So there's that old saying, right, which is that you don't give a man a fish. What do? You teach him the fish. Now, I don't recommend eating meat, so I probably wouldn't say that. You don't plant a tree for the man, you get him to plant trees. You teach him how to do things for himself. And what I'm hopeful of showing you from the weekend is I'm hopeful that you will learn some things about how to do some things for yourself with your relationship with God here. Not because you want somebody else to do it for you, but because you want to do it for yourself. That's what I'm hopeful that you'll take away from the sessions. Because I feel that if you take that away from our session, you will have the rest of your life, which will include your spirit life, where you're discovering new truth, discovering new information, discovering all new things, and able to determine for yourself what is truth, and therefore also enjoy your own discoveries, rather than being told something from somebody else. So while I could answer all of those questions, and sometimes I have in the past answered all of those questions that I've just read out, I don't feel in the long run that answering those questions benefits my audience very much. Because I've discovered the answers to those questions, and your reliance on me to answer those questions is not going to help you personally acknowledge the truth for yourself. All it does is you'd have to trust me. And I'm not asking you to trust me. What I'm asking you to do is to learn how to trust God. Learn how to determine for yourself what is true and what is loving and what is right and what is humble and what is faith and what is will. Do these things for yourself. And once you do these things for yourself, then you'll be able to discover anything along any train of thought that you want. So, some of you are interested in music, yes? How many musicians, You're going to want to discover everything about music, right? If you're interested in it. Now, some of you are not interested in music. Some of you are who's interested in mathematics? Very few. There must be a fear associated with mathematics. What's the fear? What's the fear? What are most people's fear about mathematics? I'm stupid, yeah. Wrong. Because there is only a right and wrong, isn't there, in maths? It's either solvable or not solvable, it's right or wrong, yeah. What else? So we have fear of getting something wrong, making a mistake. Anything else that comes to mind? What happened when you're a child when you got things wrong when you're at school? You were made to feel bad by somebody, right? Usually the teacher or your parents or other kids or whatever. So that's going to add to the fear, right? You know that mathematics is one of the most incredible ways to find out a lot about God. Yeah? It's really worth understanding what you can in mathematics because it helps you understand a lot about God. Mathematics is all about law. And God is all about law as well. God created, in fact, the very structure of the universe is law. Right? So it's fascinating. So what about science? Who of you are interested in science? Yeah, quite a number of people interested in science. A lot, mostly males. Why is that, girls? What's going on there? It's the mathematics of the science that's a problem. Yeah. So I would look at that too, because there's fascinating things that you can find out about God in science. Like, for example, you know how I discovered the hierarchy of law, which is a principle of divine truth, by looking at two scientific principles. And I could see that one overcame the other. Do you know what the two scientific principles were? Gravity and aerodynamics. Yeah. And I saw the aerodynamics overcome gravity, but the law of gravity still existed at the same time. So what that told me was that maybe there were other laws that where one overcame the other, but both existing at the same time. And then it was shortly after that, or in the same lifetime after that, that I discovered the law of compensation and the law of repentance. Law of repentance overcoming the law of compensation. Both laws existing at the same time, but if you engage the law of repentance, it was like the law of compensation didn't exist to you anymore. The hierarchy of law. And that principle, the hierarchy of law, come from the examination of the physical universe. Does that make sense? You can discover all these kind of things for yourself. It's a fascinating discoveries that you can make about God and God's universe if you allow yourself to go through these processes. Who enjoys going down the beach and body surfing? Any of you? Surely San Diegans would enjoy some of that. Yeah, okay. Very fascinating what you can learn down there. You learn principles of momentum, for example, that you don't have to provide all the energy to yourself in order to get from one place to another. You can use forces of nature, that you call them, to get from one place to another, right? So when you're in the surf, all you have to do is get the surf at the right place, and the surf itself will provide and produce all of your momentum. Is that not true? It's very simple. That's what happens. And I'm thinking, okay, this is first century again, thinking, what if that's the case with a lot of the things regarding the soul? That all I've got to do is just get the thing at the right place, rather than having to do it all myself. And then these forces of the universe take over and take me from one place to another. Right? Just like a wave taking you from outside of the beach onto the beach. What if that's true? And that's what caused me to think about things like law of attraction, law of cause and effect, all these waves that you can catch if you know what they're doing, and actually use them to improve your condition from one place to another without you needing to provide a heap of information to the process, or a heap of intelligence to the process, or a heap of effort to the process. Right? So something like the law of attraction, all I've got to do is be sensitive to when it happened. So when an event happened, I go, event. And remember, events are happening every moment by moment. I'm going, this is something eventually you will engage so quickly that in the course of the day you might have 500 different responses to different events, right? That have happened, that you have acknowledged in terms of yourself internally, and that have moved you from one place to another. And you've just got to catch it at the right place. You know what most of us do? We sit there in the surf of the law of attraction, and we bash up against the wall of water that's coming at us and pushing us in one direction. Like, the law of attraction is pushing you into your emotion every time. Every time. It's trying to get you to feel something. Right? And what do? It's like, bash, I don't want to feel that. We're bashing against the waves. It's like standing in the surf and these great big rollers coming in, right? And you're just sitting there getting hammered. And that's what it feels like. You are doing that, actually. You're sitting there getting hammered, right? Because you're not going along with the wave, catching the law of attraction at the right place, going along with it and letting yourself feel the emotion that it generated in you. The whole purpose of that law is to get you to grow and feel something. Yeah? So let it do its work, right? I feel the law of cause and effect is like that as well. Tracing the cause to the effect. A lot of times we're getting bombarded with the effects of our choices in our life every single moment, and we have no idea why it happened. So one of the most frequent questions I get asked is this: I'm sick, and they'll list what the sickness is. Why has that happened? Well, it's happened because you haven't traced the connection between the cause and the effect. You think that sickness is not being created by something emotionally that exists inside of you. That's why it's happened, right? All you need to do is be sensitive to the cause, and you'll find it out easy enough. The effect will actually, the beautiful thing about this law is when you let yourself feel the emotion that the effect causes inside of you, you automatically start feeling the reason emotionally why that particular event occurred. So, for example, if you caught cancer, one of the effects would be that you'd feel your life would be threatened. You would feel the threat of your potential death. That is one of the emotions that you would need to feel in order to cure your cancer. Does that make sense? And yet what do? We go, no, it's not that simple. We'll bash against that wave too, you know. We just bash against every wave that these laws are bringing to us. And so I feel a lot of the times we have an opportunity to make a different choice. And what I'd like to encourage you to do in closing of our seminar here in San Diego is to choose differently. Choose to accept emotion rather than reject it. Choose to not fight God's laws and accept God's laws rather than rejecting them. Choose to go through the experience. Choose to analyse everything in harmony with love to determine the truth. Choose to act in harmony with love. Remember, take action. Choose to use your will to develop a desire. Choose to have some faith rather than just taking on the world's viewpoint that there's no point in having any. Choose those things. Use your will, make a different choice. Because I feel if you do that, your life will change significantly. That's the only way my life has changed. So in the first century, that's how my life changed. I chose to make different choices. Chose to make loving choices. And then I learnt a lot of things that nobody knew for many, many years after my passing, still didn't know. And there's many people on earth right now who still don't know what I learned in that short period of my life in the first century, 33 years. Choose differently. That's what I would suggest to you. Okay. Myself and Mary have enjoyed your company this weekend, actually, and enjoyed your openness as well. And by the way, we are not offended by any question that you could ask. The only time we ever, as I said before, that we ever remove someone from our audience is when questions are asked with the spirit of rage or the spirit of trying to humiliate or belittle or cause some other kind of unpleasant emotion. Under those circumstances, we don't generally answer such questions. Does it make sense? But when a person has an open heart, an open mind, and an open desire to be humble and hear the answer, even though they might not agree with it, then we're completely happy to engage those particular things. We're having our next port of call is in Texas, actually. We go from here next week down to Texas, near Austin. We're having a little gathering with, I don't know how many, I think there's about 30-something people, 30 or 38, I think, total, people who are coming down. And what we're going to do there is going to be more confronting. We feel we've not spent any large amounts of time with large groups of people Because generally that's not what we do. What we do is just present some truth and let everybody decide what they're going to do with it. But in this case, the guys who wanted to create the event down in Texas decided that they'd like to spend a bit more time with us. And so what we're going to do is spend a bit more time and talk to people about the specific issues that come up during the, I think it's 7, 10 days, 9 days that we're there. The guys in Philadelphia, who met in Philadelphia, there was about 45 of us who met in Philadelphia. They said to me that they wanted you to know that even though they don't know you, they love you. Right? So they wanted to give their love to you. And the guys from Australia wanted to do the same. Many of them you probably would see on the videos of the guys in Australia, so many of them wanted to express their love for you as well. So I pass those greetings on to you. I can't pass their love on to you because that's something you'll have to feel from them, right? Mary, you wanted to mention?
Just wanted to add a couple of things.
Sure, come up. Just careful of bumping the...
Yep.
Yeah, we'll just stand in the middle of it. This is
Uh,
Mary. She hasn't been with us.
No, I
have you?
haven't been up this weekend. Hi, everyone. I wanted to especially thank, and I'm sure you do too, Lawrence, Jennifer, I can't see her, and Carl for really looking after us this weekend, taking care of our venue and just being attentive to our needs. And to thank everyone else who donated to make the trip possible. So thanks very much, you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And probably Carol and Marie for
Oh,
inviting us in the first place. Would you
Sure.
like to thank her as
Sure.
well? Because it was one email that got us here.
And also to let people know if I understand, we haven't been closely involved with the logistics of the Texas event, but if anyone does wish to attend, I believe that you are still able to, there's still places available right up until the time we start. So if anyone wants to take that opportunity, the person to contact is a lady called Robin who lives in Texas. So I don't know how to tell you how to do that.
I can't remember her email address.
I do know it actually.
You do you?
So we won't put this on the World Wide Web, but
What happens generally with truth is that we hear truth, we hear truth, we hear truth until a saturation point. And this saturation point, right, is the level of emotion that we allow. Does that make sense? Now, if I attempt to share anything beyond that point with you, I am firstly working against your will, because your will is saying I can't allow more than that. So I can't do that. So as soon as I start feeling that from an audience, I have to stop. Does that make sense? And also, as soon as that happens, unless something is processed emotionally, no more truth will ever be received by your soul. Does that make sense? And so it's the level of emotion that we allow that dictates what's going to happen beyond this saturation point. Now, what God's trying to do is stretch your soul. So God's trying to overwhelm you all the time. Because when you're overwhelmed, you stretch, right? You grow. So God's trying to overwhelm you all the time. Most of us on the planet are trying to resist the process of being overwhelmed, right? So we're actively working against what God's laws are trying to achieve. So God's laws are trying to continue to share more truth with you, and we get to this saturation point because we are unwilling to feel the emotion that such truth generates within ourselves. The key is to work your way through that resistance so that you no longer resist it. And if you do that, you can progress quite rapidly. If you don't do that, you'll find you'll look back at 5 years, in 5 years' time, and you'll look at yourself and you go, I'm no different than 5 years ago. And there are many people we know in Australia who have listened for 5 years now, and they are no different from when we first met them. That's because they have been unwilling to feel emotion beyond their saturation point. Yeah. So we'd recommend that you don't do that. We don't do that. Mary and I don't do that. It's pretty much every day we're overwhelmed by something,
Yep.
isn't it, darling?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we've just responded to an invitation, really. Yeah, yeah. The issue that many people who are coming don't realise, though, is that it's going to be a bit harder than what they think. Yeah. But that's fine. And my feelings are, don't be afraid of the process, but be aware of what it might engage. So for example, if you get triggered with anger, like AJ says something to you in the first 5 minutes you're there, and you get angry. Yeah. Now, understand the anger is generated because we have an addiction that we need to feel about. Now, if I engage that process of feeling the addiction, then the anger should dissipate, shouldn't it? But if the anger doesn't dissipate, then it tells me that we're not addressing with the addiction. And then, you know what will happen, what AJ will do then? He will tell you you're not addressing it.
And then there'll be another addiction that's not being met.
Does that make sense? He'll tell you he's not addressing it, and then you feel even more angry about 2 things now. Right? And then more angry about 3 things, and more angry about 4 things, and before you know it, you're just angry all the time with me. And usually sometime between the first anger and the anger all the time, I'll ask you to leave. Does that make sense? Because I don't deserve your anger. I'm giving you my time for nothing. I don't deserve your anger. And my feelings are, if you remind yourself of the process, the addiction covers the fears. If you remind yourself of the process that I've described many times, and you put that into practice in the situation, right? That's the key. In the situation, do it in the situation. You will have no trouble spending any amount of time with me whatsoever. None whatsoever. You'll actually might think that I'm a nice person rather than a cruel.
Yeah, I was going to say, to me, working at about this level, that's a lot of the work that most of us in the West need to look at. And after that, my experience is things get easier. It's that stuff that feels icky, and we just think, I should just be crying. I should be releasing causal emotion. But gee whiz, I feel really stuck, and I go. But actually hanging in there, and as you said, recognising this is a part of the process, acknowledging my addictions, recognising the things that I do that aren't very loving, that I have the power to change. Working in that area is so valuable. And I see people who want to skip it all the time and go to the fears and the grief, but you can't actually get there unless you really look at yourself. Yeah.
So our focus basically in Texas is going to be there. That's our focus.
Yeah.
That's okay. I think you'll be laughing at the end of it too if you deal with them. But honestly, we know it's impossible to address some emotions in the group situation, and it's impossible to do with them in 1 week. We know that. The key is how you handle yourself in this time, whether you revert to anger or passive aggression or denial, or are you going to let yourself stay in this addiction, feeling the addiction, and get to some fear? That's the key. The key is if you can let yourself stay in the feeling of the addiction and feeling some of the fear under it, you will be fine.
And it'll be a productive week.
It'll be productive.
Yeah.
So school everybody first about how they should react. Is that how? I prefer not to do that. I prefer to just have people react and then tell them how they could react. I feel that if I school you in how you should react, there is a temptation for you to engage your mind again in the process of reaction rather than just feeling the reaction. Understand?
And I see that with people, even with this, teaching that we've spoken about so many times. Anger covers addiction, covers fear, covers grief. I see people hearing about an addiction and then wanting to grieve because they think, oh, that's what I should do. That's what will fix it. But they're not actually working through the process emotionally. They're trying to skip intellectually. So
there are certain emotions, of course, that we don't like. Now, in the West here, the biggest probably emotion we try to avoid is that one. So here's our addiction, and here's our anger. Most people in the West are okay with anger. When I say okay, you're okay with passive-aggressive expression of anger or aggressive expression of anger. Most people in the West are okay with that. But then what we do, once we realise that we're getting angry all the time, what we go is, oh, okay, we need to grieve. So here's grief right down here. And so what we try to do is we try to skip from there to there. You don't learn much doing that. You don't learn what addictions you've created to generate your rage. You don't learn what fears they are that the addictions cover over. You don't get to feel the addiction or feel the fear. And if you don't get to feel them, at some point in your future, they are going to restrict your growth. So you have to go through the process of feeling them. You can't do anything else.
So in practice, if somebody goes from like anger to grief, like you're helping them go back to their addiction?
No. No, I'm perfectly happy for them to go from their anger to their grief. But the next time I trigger something, there'll probably be another fear and another addiction come up, which I'll point out. Does that make sense? I'm not adverse to the person experiencing an emotion, whatever is present. But what I'm saying to you is, at some point in time, you're going to have to go through this process from an emotional perspective.
And I suppose, Angela, to maybe clarify a bit what I'm saying is, very often I see people say they've been unloving in a situation, and that's pointed out. And instead of recognising, oh, I've got a demand that makes me feel that I can be unloving, I see them go, oh, that's because my mother didn't love me.
And then they have a big cry about mum not loving them, and it's got nothing to do with what we just raised. So they're allowed to have a cry about mum not loving them. Perhaps their mother didn't love them, right? But the reality is the willingness that they had to treat somebody else badly had nothing to do with their mother not loving them. It had everything to do with an unethical position within their heart, thinking that they should be able to dump on other people rather than feel their own emotions. So
often driven by a heap of addictions and expectations that they're going to have to face at some point. Yeah.
Like you don't treat other people badly because your mum didn't love you. My mum didn't love me much, and I don't treat other people badly. So you don't treat other people badly for that reason. You treat other people badly because you have an addiction to treat other people badly. You get something out of it. You like it. There's something you like from it. And you need to feel what that is if you want to get rid of that emotion. And what a lot of people try to do is skip from. They get told, you just treated somebody badly. Oh, that's all about my dad and how he treated me. And then they go and have a big cry about that. And the reality is it had nothing to do with the discussion. Well, it might have had something to do with some other emotion, but not with the discussion we just had.
I see a lot of people have a lot of judgment of their addictions because their addictions are often, as I mentioned earlier, where we're using our will to be unloving, to demand things or push other people or whatever it is.
Control, manipulate.
You know, a lot of things that we feel ashamed of, afraid of, that we have judgment of. And that's why I said sometimes it feels like a really hard place to really face this. But in my experience, it's only when I've done that that I've gotten any real change in my soul in terms of love.
Because I think sometimes, a lot of times I go from years to years. And so my question was coming from a place of fear of getting it wrong. And I guess sometimes just not going to that addiction.
Sometimes we can let go of addictions pretty
Rapidly.
easily. We go, oh my gosh, I'm angry. Oh, that wasn't really fair. Oh my gosh, now I'm feeling something. And that can be real. But I suppose being around people talking about this path a lot over the last 6 years, I see people try to do the jump intellectually because they want to get it right and they don't want to face the thing that they judge. Yeah.
And it's frequently these two areas that cause most of our resistance to change. Once we get to there, it's pretty easy, actually. You just have a good cry and receive some more of God's love, and bang, the changes have been made. You know?
I suppose too that like going from intellectual from anger to greed takes you away from that. The part that you said was the most unloving is how we treat others is wrapped up in addiction.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. How you treat others is very rarely wrapped up in grief. Do you understand? How you treat others is always related to fear. See you later, guys. Is always related to fear or an addiction. Always. So when you treat other people badly, it's not because your mummy didn't love you. It's because of what you've now chosen to do, which is unethical towards other people regarding your emotion. Yeah. Good day. Well, we'd like to finish now. I've been talking now for 6 hours.
Long
So
time.
I'd like to finish now. Thanks, guys, for your time, and it's been great meeting you. So thanks, guys. We'll see you at another location, perhaps, at some point in the future.